Okay, my name is Donald Fenniak. I work at a company called Visio that's a local startup. And I want to talk about idiomatic Ruby, idiomatic Rails, idiomacy generally. I don't know if that's actually a word, but I'm going to say it a bunch today. This talk was inspired because I recently went into a new code base, and it was a Rails code base, but it just looked really unfamiliar to me, and I was really confused. So I was talking to a friend about it, and he said, well, you know what, none of the code is wrong. It's just the person who wrote it had an accent. I was like, kind of like chuckled, and then I was like, wait, that's actually true, because this guy had come from writing different programming languages. So when he was writing Ruby, it didn't look like Ruby to me. When he was writing Rails, it didn't look like Rails to me. So that's kind of what inspired the talk. So if it's not evident, oh, sorry, we'll go through what the talk is, what's going to happen. We're going to talk about what being idiomatic means, what that means in programming, why we should care about it, and then we'll go through some examples from Ruby and from Rails to see what that means in action. Yeah, okay. So what does idiomatic mean? It means conforming to the syntactical, grammatical, or structural form peculiar to a language. And then there's another definition below. Pretty much it just means speaking or communicating in the way someone would expect you to. So this exists in every language, and it changes from language to language. So in idiomatic English, we have a particular way that we'll order adjectives. So we would say a sweet new big red car. We wouldn't say a red sweet new big car. Don't look at that one too long, because whenever I look at it too long, I get confused and I don't know what order they're supposed to be in anymore. We also have things called idioms. These are little expressions that kind of only make sense in the language that we're speaking in. So in English, you can say something costs an arm and a leg. If you said that in French, the person you're speaking to just wouldn't understand it. They'd be like, what does that mean? In French, there's an expression, it costs the eyes in your head, which sounds really weird in English. You could say, another one is, the door is over there, but in French you would say, la porte est là, which is, a female door is over there, which is so nonsensical in English. But there are gendered nouns in different languages. So to speak English idiomatically, we just follow these kind of patterns and conventions. This one is amazing. I stumbled upon it looking at idiomatic English. So it's called Ablaut Reduplication. Reduplication is when you use a word that kind of like rhymes back to back. So like ding dong, bing bong. In English, we always do these in the order of the first letter being I, the second letter being A or O. So if you look at every single one of these, tic tac, zigzag, ping pong, dilly dally, tim tams, riff raff, they're all IA. And we just all do this naturally without even knowing we're doing it, which is really mind-blowing to me. And then the same thing applies at a higher level of abstraction. So Yoda is always talking backwards. Like, easier to understand I would be if idiomatically I spoke. That sentence is confusing. Everything Yoda says is confusing, and then it like sounds deep or mystical just because it's confusing, which is weird. But the whole point is that there's these idioms. There's a manner of speaking conventionally or communicating conventionally that applies higher up than if we go back, the level of like a single word or a little bit of a sentence. It also applies to a whole sentence, and maybe arguably even to the level of something like a presentation. It's very standard to start with like, this is what the presentation is about. We're going to start with the simple concepts and then build up to complicated concepts, stuff like that. Right. So the other important thing I want to note is that what's idiomatic is mutable. So it changes depending on where you are. Like in Jamaica, the way they speak English is very different from how they speak it here. It also changes over time. So there's this weird expression, 23 skidoo, which used to mean like, I gotta go, like I'm leaving. You would 23 skidoo. And people just said that in like the 30s or something, I don't know. But that's not a thing anymore. So there's like this aspect of languages changing, idioms disappearing, new ones appearing. Yeah, so that's really important. And I think the same will apply as we go into like talking about programming idiomacy. There's things that we used to do that we don't do anymore. There's things, yeah, that change with time. Okay, so what's idiomatic programming? The exact same concept we just covered of like, you know, trying to speak the language the way a native speaker would. The same thing, but instead of a native speaker, maybe we can say an expert in that programming language or someone familiar with it. Yeah. So like linguistic idioms, we have the really small one-liners, and these are called programming idioms. So we have, for example, here's what like looping over an array looks like, or mapping an array in Ruby versus Python. Each of those would be called an idiom. To get into the more broad stuff, and I think this is actually kind of contentious, and there's a bit of debate in the community about what the term idiomatic means, whether we're just talking about these small little idioms, or if we're talking about conventions as a whole. So if we're talking about conventions as a whole, which is the way I like to interpret it, I think design patterns, architecture, whether you're using functional sort of programming versus object-oriented, I think that's very tied up in what's idiomatic. And I would say even things like framework and library choices, if we're getting very broad with it. So you could probably use this hip new library that lets you compile your Ruby into JavaScript and run it in your browser. That would be very non-idiomatic web programming. It would be an odd choice that a native web programmer would not understand. Okay, so why do we care about this? Why do we want our code to be idiomatic? Who cares if my Ruby looks like JavaScript? The first reason that we should care is it makes communication better within your code. Well-written code should be very communicative, and that's one of the goals of Ruby as a language, right? Is to make the code easy to read, easy to understand. If I'm looking at your code and I'm expecting to see Ruby and I see something that looks like JavaScript, I'm going to be confused. I'm going to have to read the line twice. I'm going to have to try to understand it better. So that, to me, that's the biggest one, is just making it easier to understand, easier to read. Generally speaking, development follows what the community is doing. So if everybody is using a particular feature or writing things a particular way, whatever happens in your open source community will probably follow that and optimize for that. So if I'm using a feature of Ruby that nobody else knows exists, it's really unlikely that anyone will optimize or extend that or help me use it in a better way. Deprecations, so if they're going to take things out of a language or out of a framework, it's most likely they won't take out the thing that everybody's using, right? So 23 skidoo disappeared from English because it was a handful of weird people saying it. If you're saying goodbye instead, we're probably not going to deprecate that from English anytime soon because everybody says it. So the same applies to Ruby, to Rails. If you're using some obscure feature, it's more likely to get deprecated. If you're doing what's conventional, what's idiomatic, it's less likely to be deprecated. And I think performance follows from what I said about development following the community. Okay, so that's why we should care about idiomatic programming. We're going to pause. Are there any questions at this point about linguistic idiomacy versus programming? Hi, Ben.
Yeah, I'm curious, and talk a little bit grammar. Similarly for programming, are we talking about best practice?
That's a really good question. So what Ben had asked was how this relates back to grammar and best practices. So are we talking, when we say idiomatic, about what's grammatical or what people are doing? Interestingly, I think the two are actually very tied together. A lot of linguists will describe grammar as just being what sounds natural to people. We always think of it as being like this kind of like chiseled in stone on a mountainside, and that's grammar, and we have to do it that way. But it's actually like a good example would be the word literally, which recently has completely changed its meaning and now means the opposite of what it once meant. So I think we are talking about best practices. I think it is best practice to be idiomatic, but the nature of being idiomatic is a very fluid thing, and it is generally, I would say, what the community is doing. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers the question. It's a tough one. Okay, so idiomatic Ruby. So much like in English, we talked about how English doesn't have gendered nouns. The properties of the language itself are going to determine what's idiomatic in that language. In Ruby, it's the same story. So we know Ruby is object-oriented. We know that it supports functional programming. We know it supports imperative programming. Also, if we go to the actual like Ruby docs, what they say is it's focused on simplicity and productivity. It should be natural to read, easy to write. We know it's dynamically typed. So all of these things are going to kind of influence how we try to write idiomatically. Okay, so I think the easiest place to find, whoa, how do I copy and paste from this? The easiest place to find idiomatic Ruby is this giant style guide from Rubocop, which if you've never used, it's like a linter for Ruby that helps you make sure you're writing your code consistently. And it just has a ton of examples of things that they consider good or bad, and how the community is using it. It's very flexible, so if you are one of those people who's like, no, I'm an iconoclast, I don't believe in doing things the way Rubocop says, you can change it. But generally speaking, it's a really good guide. So for example, this one I didn't even know was a thing until I looked at this guide, but you can put, the bang is not in Ruby. So you can put a space between your bang and your variable. I didn't even know that was a thing. But Rubocop is saying, no, it's more idiomatic to not have that space there. Yeah. Assigning variables and how to indent them. So this is all like kind of the, I would say, boring idiomatic stuff, which is like how we put spaces where, you know, where your periods and commas are. Okay, so if you're interested in finding out the finer points of how to space your code and stuff in Ruby, check that out, read through it. Going into some examples of sort of, again, like that very low-level kind of idiom. We have, in Ruby, it is so common to use array.each or array.map for loops in Ruby. I don't know why, but I don't think I've ever seen one. Just like nobody does it. It's just weird. It's a thing. That's how it is. This is one of my favorites, the second one. My object.value question mark. In Ruby, there's a convention where a question mark on the end of a method will tell you that this will always return to you a true or false value. If you ever got a string back from this, somebody screwed up. In JavaScript or other languages, you might see the not my object.value. So that's just like kind of transforming it so that you'll always get a true or false back. But in Ruby, we would just write our method to do that. On the next line, the myValue.nil, Ruby is very focused on trying to make things readable, right? I think if we go back, natural to read and easy to write. So like you can almost hear this. It's like, nil? Is that nil? Right? The question mark like is just really communicative. Versus doing something like myValue equal nil. Rails extends a bunch of these as well, where you have dot present and stuff like that. Ruby has the unless word instead of if not on the other side. And again, that just makes it really easy to read. So if I say x.save unless x can't save, that's pretty understandable to a human. But if I say x.save if not x.can't save, that's too many negatives and I get a little confused. The last one I'm going to point out is the bang method convention. So there is in Ruby x.downCase, where x is presumably a string. And that's just going to return to me the value of x downcased. But with a bang, it actually mutates my variable in place. So x will now automatically be downcased, instead of having to assign it as we do on the right here in the non-idiomatic column. Interestingly, I think this one gets confused very often because people think the bang means this mutates it in place. But in Ruby, what that bang means is just there's two versions of this method. This one might have side effects or something. Maybe check it out. Like maybe think about it before you use it. So we'll see that when we get into Rails. There's examples from there as well. Also, just quickly, the cases. Variables are snake-cased. We don't headless camel cases or variables. Constants are always screaming for some reason. And classes are not screaming. Just so you know. Also, there's no shish kebab case anywhere, so don't do that. Okay, and then the last thing I want to point out is there's rules that apply kind of to all languages. So things like keeping it dry. That's not a Ruby thing in particular, but that is just a programming thing that we all know. So we should be observing that. We should be doing the keep it simple and all the rest of them. Yeah, so I think there's actually a parallel to that in linguistics as well. There's something called Grice's maxims, which is like when we're speaking, we try to be concise, we try to be on topic, all of the rest of this stuff, and that applies. That's not an English thing, that's just a communication thing. Likewise, there's rules like that in programming. So when we're writing idiomatic Ruby, we try to stay true to all of those. Going back to those sort of high-level stuff that's not just talking about individual methods or individual idioms, we have in Ruby, I think, and this stuff is all very debatable, so if anybody feels differently, please put your hand up. I'd love to hear it. But I think it's very idiomatic to write many small objects and classes. That kind of stays true to the whole single responsibility principle. They each do just a bitty little thingy. Inheritance or composition, I think if you're coming from the Rails world, you'll probably feel like inheritance is more idiomatic. And then other design patterns, I think one that's very idiomatic to Ruby is pub/sub, or the observer pattern. Ruby actually has a built-in module for observables that's really easy to use. Yeah, so I think that's one that they kind of encourage you towards, so you'll see it often. Yeah. Okay, so Rails. Likewise with Ruby, the high-level stuff, we have the general rules that apply. We want to keep it dry. We want to keep it simple. On top of that, we have all the Ruby rules. So going back to these, it should look something like this because it is written in Ruby. Then we also have the things that are very particular to Rails. It's an MVC framework, the model view controller. So we know it'll probably share some idiomatic elements with things like Django or whatever other ones you're familiar with. And then Rails adds a really interesting one, which is convention over configuration. So the idea is you should have to, with Rails, write very little code when you're doing things in a conventional manner. It's only when you're going outside of that and doing really weird things that you should have to write a little more code. For things like getting a website up, like looking at Alan's presentation just before, it's really quick if you're sticking with standard Rails to just be like scaffold, push, I'm done, right? It's only when you want to do things that are really interesting that you have to write a lot more code. Not to diss your project, it was a great project. Okay, so that's kind of the high level stuff. Going back to the level of the little idioms, we have things in Rails like author.books, which would be presumably there's an active record relationship between those two. Instead of writing something like book.where author ID equals author.id, which is totally valid. You could write that. It would run in Rails. It's fine. But this definitely is a little more readable, so it's keeping true to that sort of convention. The bang methods. Oh, this one is actually, this one should not be a bang. Sorry. Fix this quickly. So in Rails, we have those bang methods from Ruby. So we have myModel.save is different from myModel.save without a bang. And it actually, what that does is it raises an error if it fails to save. If you try to do that without the bang, it'll just return false to you to let you know that it didn't save, but it won't raise an error, which is useful. Like if you can imagine a Rails controller where you have like, you know, if this saves, send a success message. If it doesn't save, then send something else. So you might not want to raise an error. There are valid cases for not saving the object. But if you do want to save, or if you do want to raise an error when it fails to save, you're only ever expecting the object to be able to save, then you might want something like this method and not doing something non-idiomatic like an unless myModel.save. Active record relation methods. So much like going back to the Ruby one quickly, we had that .nil that's just a little more readable, a little easier to understand. Rails introduces a bunch that are kind of the same thing, where you could write out in SQL active record relations that check if your table is empty or if your query returned no results. It's much more idiomatic to just use the Rails tools that they give us. So call .any question mark, .empty. I think there's a handful of others. I'm not sure. The non-idiomatic way would be to write raw SQL or to kind of like hack around in active record to try to make that happen. Yeah. Similarly, we have .find by underscore column name. So here we have an example that's an email. Rails provides us with a ton of these that are super easy to read. They all operate kind of the same way, which is great. It dries things up really well. And again, it is possible to do it with like chaining active record relation methods. Maybe you could do .where email equals email .first. That would work. That would run in Rails, but it wouldn't be as easy to read. It wouldn't be as conventional. It wouldn't be idiomatic. Likewise, there's scopes introduced in Rails, which are essentially just like a good way of storing active record queries or components of queries, I suppose. And we also have default scopes. So if we want to do something like a really common one is a soft delete, where we have a deleted column, and then your default scope is to where the object hasn't been deleted yet. Yeah. And the non-idiomatic way, again, is to use SQL chained active record relation methods. Rails introduces a bunch of time tools, things like one.day ago, one.day.from now, .beginning of day, all that jazz. We can still do, in Ruby, we can do our time math on our own. It's just very non-idiomatic. It's hard to read. Any like really experienced Ruby developer, I think would, or Rails developer, I should say, would probably be using the more idiomatic version. Okay, I'm going to stop because I've been talking a lot and very quickly. Does anybody have any questions at this point or thoughts?
What other kind of
There's a ton. Let's see. Yeah, sorry, I probably blazed over that a bit. So we have any.blank, destroy all, many, which I'm assuming is kind of the opposite of any, or returns true if there's more than one. Yeah, so there's all of this stuff that makes it very readable. A lot of this stuff too, the real advantage of it is it's really well optimized. So if you're worried about how your code is going to perform in production, generally speaking, the active record methods will be faster than if you don't know SQL and are writing it yourself. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you have any comment on like tabs versus?
Oh man. So the question was if I care about tabs versus spaces. I prefer spaces. I'm not going to fight anybody about it. Also, the Rubocop docs say to use 2 spaces, so spaces are probably right. But if you use tabs, go nuts. Good. Yes, it is. It certainly is. I think it's actually one of the first things in the Rubocop docs is like 2 spaces. Oh, sure. So dry is don't repeat yourself. So that's the idea. I think it's like probably the most important programming practice in my opinion. The idea is if you're having to write the same code multiple times, you should figure out a way to share that code instead. We've talked about, let's see if I can backtrack for 1 second. Okay, never mind. I can't find it, but there's different ways of handling that. You can use inheritance. You can use composition. So you can bring a module into something to be able to share that code, or you can inherit from some parent object in different places. So yeah, don't repeat yourself. KISS is keep it simple, which I think I was reading about it. I think it came from like the Navy or something. So it's a weird backstory. It's not actually from software, but the premise is just like, don't complicate the code more than it needs to be. I'm sure like every one of you, if you've written enough code, you've probably over-engineered something. I definitely have, where I've had to like stop, throw it all out, and then write it in 10 lines instead of 200. And then what was the other one? Solid? I always forget solid. It is, oh, has more than one meaning. So it's a mnemonic, and it means single responsibility principle, which is sort of one class only does one thing. Open closed, open for extension, closed for modification. Liskov substitution, I'm not even sure what that one is. Yeah, but yeah, it's just a bunch of rules that try to like say how to write good software. I think this stuff originates from Java, so not all of it applies super well to Ruby, but generally speaking, most of it does. The single responsibility principle is really important, I think. Yeah. Okay, so going back up from, or wait, were there any more questions? I'm sorry. Okay, so going back up from the level of our teensy little idioms to like higher level stuff, I think idiomatic Rails, and again, what's idiomatic changes depending on your context, so you can have a different view of this, and that's totally valid. I think that it's very idiomatic to use popular gems instead of home rolling things. I think you'll find that most Rails developers are bringing in a lot of gems. I think devise is a really obvious one where most people aren't building their own authentication systems. Definitely it's not idiomatic if you're using like some gem with like 1 star on GitHub that like some guy you know made, but you really like him, so you want to use it. Sidekick is more popular than delayed job as an example for that. I actually did check the Git repos, so you guys don't have to fact check me. RSpec is more popular than Minitest, weirdly, which ships with Rails. I think both of those would be fine, and both are like fairly idiomatic. But it's interesting to think that like there is more people in the community using RSpec than what ships with Rails. It seems like, anyway. Skinny controllers. This is kind of a modern one that used to be different. Like it used to be all about fat models, but now, fat controllers and skinny models. Now we're trying to push all of that business logic somewhere else and out of controllers. I won't say that fat models is a thing because now people are kind of moving away from that and towards services and microservices, which I think is a big change going on in the community right now, where what was idiomatic 5 years ago would have been to have a lot of logic in your models, really big, like importing lots of modules into them, versus like nowadays they're trying to break all of that out into smaller services that are doing stuff, maybe even different Rails apps and microservices, like node apps, etc., that all push data or whatever you need into your Rails app. And then the last one is convention over configuration, which we talked about a little bit. I think if you're looking at building a really big Rails app, you should follow similar patterns to what Rails does. Rails has active record that all of your models should be inheriting from. All of your controllers are inheriting from action controllers. So inheritance is a really strongly used pattern in Rails. I would say that trying to build things in a similar way where you have like a base that's very extensible, I would say that's a very high level Rails idiom. Cool, and that is my last slide. How are we doing for time? 20? Okay. I'm just gonna really quickly, I'm not gonna live code, I'm gonna show you guys an example of something that I wrote. I was planning on live coding this, but I don't want you to be here all day. Some of you are like glazing over already. Okay, so I tried to write functional Ruby code here's the goal. I have this studentgrades.rb that's creating 2 constants for me. And actually, I'll just pull it up. Okay, so it's really simple. You can see that there's this like hash of students, and then the courses they took and the grades they got. So I took a Ruby course, I got 45. I took a Rails course and I got a 40. Mark took the same courses and he got a 98 and a 95. And then we have a letter grade mapping. The idea is that an A is somewhere between 94 and 100. Okay, so I had to write a little script that would spit out for me this text, report card, the student with their name, the course with the course's name, and then letter grade with the grade that they got in that course. So this is what I ended up writing, trying to write functional Ruby, which I will admit I am not good at. So I'm sure if a real functional programmer tried this, they could make it way more legible. So what I did was I defined a bunch of lambdas, like print name is a lambda that takes in a name and then spits out, when you call it, it spits out the right text. Print courses is a similar one that has print course within it, and it just maps through our student or our courses and spits out each one. And then print course actually has two separate methods that it takes in, one of which prints the course name and the other that prints the grade. And in the end, we end up with code that I think is super confusing. And to me, this doesn't look like Ruby. I don't know. How does everybody else feel about this? I'm just curious. Any thoughts or comments? No. Yeah. It also, weirdly, all of the lines I found were getting like super long. Like this one is like, if I had to have two tabs open or a split screen, I wouldn't be able to see the ends of my lines. I didn't really know a good way to fix that. But the code does run. Like if I do Ruby non-idiomatic report card, you can see it actually spits it out. It works. Like there's nothing wrong with the code, except we all know that it's not idiomatic, which I would say is wrong. Right, and then I tried to do it in a more idiomatic way, and here's what I ended up with. I ended up using classes a lot. I didn't actually use inheritance, but I used a very object-oriented paradigm. Everything in here is an object. So we have a report card that has a student, and the report card knows how to print out. And then we have a student, and the student has courses, and the student has a name and courses, I should say. And then we have a course, which has a name and a grade. And that's kind of all there is to it. To me, this, like, when I'm reading it, this makes so much more sense. I don't know how everybody else feels about that. Okay. Everybody looks a little less confused. And again, it runs just the exact same. It's the exact same output, but it's just a very different way of writing it. So yeah, that's kind of it. That's all my thoughts on idiomatic Ruby and idiomatic Rails. Does anyone have any questions? Alan.
What parts of Rubocop
Ooh.
do you follow the word offline?
I think I'm pretty... Oh, sorry, thank you. So the question is, which parts of Rubocop do I agree with or disagree with? And I would say generally I'm pretty close to it. There's a lot of rules in it that are annoying. Like I think one of the defaults is that a method shouldn't be longer than 10 lines. But sometimes if you have to load a big stupid hash or something, like it's just unreasonable. But that said, I actually prefer having those in place for the times where I'm writing a method that's doing too much and it reminds me, versus like, you know, the odd time that I have a method which actually does have to be that long that I'm like, no, this is valid Rubocop. Yeah, I think most of it I agree with. I don't know what their opinions of hash syntax are, but a big one.
They don't like hash rockets. I saw
Really?
more hash rockets there than so hash rockets are like the old. I think
So for those For those who don't know, these are both valid syntaxes for a hash in Ruby. So you can have this sort of symbol interface on the left. So you have like this colon and then your value, or this and then a hash rocket, which is the equal and then the angle bracket. Yeah, so both are valid. I actually lean towards using the hash rocket. I think it's the reason why is because if you want to do something like a string with this method, it ends up being really weird. Also, if you want to use variables, it looks really weird.
Using string keys, probably not.
Wrong. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know. I just find the old syntax. It's a little like longer, but generally speaking, I prefer that like there's sorry. Oh, no, there's cases where you can't use the colon essentially, or the newer syntax, and because of that, I prefer having like one syntax to two. Yeah.
Do you use any kind of auto formatting tools or like little macros, and it fits in the whole rescue block for you?
I don't. I use Vim, so the code auto completion isn't always great. I think you have to do a lot of configuration for it, and I'm a very lazy person. I do often use Rubocop. You can plug it into your editor and have it tell you if your formatting isn't lined up with stuff. Yeah.
Like the using an underscore when you're passing a parameter that you're not in.
Yes, I like that as well. Sorry, the comment was just that the underscore for a parameter that you won't use, so something like where you have the second parameter there would be an unused one, but it has to be there for some reason. Another one that I actually like that I didn't mention is having optional arguments at the end. So doing something like this, where it's totally valid to call the method without 2 arguments. I think it's valid to put the options first, but I don't think I've ever seen Ruby written where your optional arguments are first, which is really interesting. I think it's valid. Maybe it isn't invalid.
Basically,
You want to just take speak into my chest? Okay. Ben is an expert on the topic for anybody that wants to hear more. Nathan?
At the higher level, are you?
I have not read it. I have heard of it. Oh, sorry. The question from Nathan was, have I read Sandy Metz's Object-Oriented Programming in Ruby? I have not. I know it's out there, and I know another really good one is supposed to be Design Patterns in Ruby, which should show you kind of how to apply the Gang of 4 design patterns, if you know those. To yeah, so. Yeah. So Nathan pointed out that those books point out well how those solid principles from Java apply to Ruby.
Sandy Metz is a big stickler for that. I think it's 4 lines of code in each function, and if you're doing more than 4, you should break it down. It's kind of like something that you said earlier that like it's one of those best cases, but sometimes you just write that like 20-line long method. It's only doing one thing, but it's not as long as things.
So Sandy Metz agrees with me that methods should be short, is the comment? Yes. But also sometimes they can't be, was the other part of that comment. Cool. Okay, well, that's it. If you want to talk more about this, I'll probably go to Mercer after. I don't know if anybody else is going. Hopefully see you there.